Why the US deficit is unsustainable. Let's talk about it all. Hello everyone and welcome to my YouTube channel. Please subscribe, leave your comments below, and please give a like to this video. When we discuss fiscal policy, we hear all sorts of theories. And one of the latest and most surprising, but certainly entertaining, is this idea that the US government can have all the deficit that it requires and it will be absorbed by the economy, and that it doesn't generate any significant problem. However, the reality is that the US deficit is, on the one hand, unsustainable, and on the other hand, a danger both to the US dollar and to the US economy. Let's first think of what a public deficit is. A public deficit is the manifestation of the inability of a government to administer the tax receipts that it gets. Furthermore, it shows the lack of ability of the government to take action and control the imbalances that may create inflation, higher taxes, or lower growth in the future. Because ultimately, deficits, which are going to be financed either by monetizing the deficit, i.e. printing money, or by increasing debt, which is also printing money, are always going to generate very significant imbalances in the future. The idea that all the deficit that a government creates is a positive for the economy, or even worse, the idea that it is a reserve for the private sector, makes no sense. To start with, we need to understand that if the US government continues to incur in a 2 trillion deficit per annum every year, the administration's own estimates of accumulated deficit between 2023 and 2030 is of $14 trillion. $14 trillion that are either going to be printed or going to be increasing the national debt. Furthermore, those deficits do not come from lack of resources. Tax receipts are at an all-time high. Furthermore, the idea that deficits happen because taxes or tax receipts are too low makes no sense. A deficit is always a spending problem. A deficit is always because the government is spending a lot more than what it receives in taxes. And a deficit is always going to be financed by making more expensive the growth of the economy, i.e. via inflation, via taxation, or via lower growth. Ultimately, a deficit is a burden on the economy, is a burden on the private sector. It is not a reserve for the private sector. It is also false that the government deficit is equal to the private sector savings, because, as we all know, debt to GDP all over the world exceeds 100% of GDP. Furthermore, the idea that the government knows exactly how much the private sector is saving and is offsetting it with its own expenditure is ludicrous, to be fairly honest. This is a complete lack of logic. The US deficit is also unsustainable because it can destroy the US dollar. So far, the US dollar is the world reserve currency thanks to the solidity and the strength of the economy of the United States, its thriving private sector, and most importantly, a transparent financial sector with legal security, with investor security. It is the place where you want to take your savings and your salary. It's the place that you prefer as a safe haven, or as a place to guarantee that your hard-earned money is going to generate a stability. That's why the US is a reserve of value. But it's not going to be a reserve of value forever if the government continues to believe that any imbalance can be passed to the rest of the world via the issuance of more debt, i.e. the issuance of more currency, and thinking that that is not going to have negative consequences. The moment that the world stops believing in the US as the world reserve currency, and that is why it's a fiat currency, faith, belief, the moment that that happens, the entire castle falls very, very rapidly. It happened to the UK, and it's happened to all of the empires that have built their strength at the beginning on military power, on economic power, and obviously afterwards taking a lot of debt, thinking that their strength would remain forever. The US deficit is not a strength. It is certainly not reserves for the private economy that will be financed forever and allow the government to run all kinds and any kind of deficit without any significant problem. The government in the United States, like any government, has both a fiscal and monetary constraint. And the monetary constraint, which is inflation, is at the same time dictating the fiscal constraint. Therefore, we need to be extremely prudent and to recommend the United States to implement a sound policy in terms of both fiscal and monetary policy if it wants to continue to be the world reserve currency. It is not going to last forever if the government takes for granted that position and pushes the limits of patience, support, faith in the currency, and therefore the US deficit not just needs to be reduced, it needs to be reduced to zero. Debt needs to be brought down, both in terms of debt to GDP, but also in absolute terms, in order to maintain the US dollar as the world reserve currency and the faith and the support and the confidence in the US economy and the US government as a viable entity. Thinking that the government can pass all of its imbalances to the private sector, either increasing taxes, increasing inflation, or both, is the recipe for ruin. Thank you for following. Thank you for watching this video. Please subscribe to my channel, like my videos, leave your comments below, and keep defending freedom. Thank you very much.